September 3, 1952. Boston, Massachusetts. Massachusetts General Hospital. The third-floor corridor outside Ward 7. 6:14 a.m. The corridor had the specific quality of hospital corridors at 6 in the morning, which was the quality of a place that has been in continuous use through the night and is now in the transition between the night staff and the day staff. The transition being visible in the specific quality of the light, which was the fluorescent light of a hospital at all hours, but which at 6 in the morning had a particular flatness that the light at other hours did not have. The flatness being the light of a place that has not yet decided whether it is still the previous day or has become the new one. The floors were clean in the way of hospital floors that are cleaned continuously rather than once, the cleaning being one of the forms of work that the hospital produced in quantities that the people who did it had long since stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the things that are always present. The smell was the smell of a hospital, which was antiseptic, and underneath the antiseptic something else. The something else being the smell of bodies and work and the specific quality of a place where the distance between living and not living was managed rather than ignored. Doctor. Catherine Wills was 28 years old and had been at Massachusetts General for 11 months as a resident in internal medicine, which was long enough to understand the specific character of the hospital, and not long enough to have become the kind of doctor who had stopped being surprised by what the work produced. The surprises being not always the dramatic kind, but more often the small kind, the kind that arrived in the middle of an ordinary morning and required the full attention of a person who had learned to keep the full attention available, even at 6 in the morning after a night shift, that had been the kind of night shift that the third floor of Ward 7 occasionally produced. She was from Providence, Rhode Island, the daughter of a man who had been a general practitioner for 30 years, and who had the specific quality of a doctor, who understood that the practice of medicine was both a science and a form of sustained attention to the specific human being in front of you, the science being available to anyone who could learn it, and the attention being available only to the people who had chosen to make it available, the choice being continuous rather than made once. She was writing notes at the nursing station at 6:14 when the door at the end of the corridor opened and the man she had not seen before came through it. He was perhaps 32 or 33 in a white coat that had the specific quality of a white coat, worn by someone who had been wearing it for long enough that the coat had become part of how he moved rather than something he was wearing, carrying a chart and reading it as he walked in the way of a person who uses the available time. He walked to the nursing station and set the chart on the counter and said to the night nurse, a woman named Patricia, who had been on the third floor for 6 years and who had the specific economy of movement of a person who has learned to do everything that the work requires without doing anything the work does not require. Margaret Chen in 307, any change overnight. Patricia said, temperature down, 0.5 degree at 3, stable since. He said, and the breathing. Patricia said, same. He said, I will look at her before rounds. He picked up the chart and looked at it, and then looked at Catherine. He said, you are the new resident. She said, 11 months. He said, new to me. He said, David Pearce. He said it without the title, which told her something about him, the omission of the title being either humility or the confidence of a person who does not need the title to establish what they are, and she could not yet tell which, but thought it was probably the second. She said, Catherine Wills. He said, internal medicine. She said yes. He said, "You were here last night." She said, "Yes." He said, "How was 307?" She said, "Stable after 2." He said, "What happened at 2?" She said, "She had a period of confusion, about 20 minutes, resolved on its own." He said, "Did you sit with her?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He picked up the chart and walked down the corridor toward 307. She watched him go and then returned to the notes, which were the notes that the night had produced and that the morning required in the specific way that hospital notes were required, as the record of what had happened and the foundation of what would happen next, the connection between the two being what the notes served. She thought about the question he had asked, "Did you sit with her?" which was not the question that most of the attending physicians asked about a patient's episode at 2 in the morning. The question that most attending physicians asked, being about the clinical response rather than about the presence of a person during the episode. The distinction between the two questions being the distinction she had been thinking about since the first week of her residency, and that she had not yet found the language for in a way that was communicable to the people who needed to hear it. She finished the notes and went home to sleep for 4 hours and came back for afternoon rounds at 2. He was at the nursing station when she arrived, reviewing charts with a methodical quality that told her the reviewing was the reviewing of a person who read what was in the chart rather than what they expected to be in the chart, the distinction being important in ways that the clinical outcomes made visible over time. He looked up when she came in and said, "How do you think Chen is doing?" She considered the question. She said, "The numbers are improving." He said, "And?" She said, "And I think she is frightened in a way the numbers do not show." He looked at her. He said, "What makes you think that?" She said, "The way she holds her hands when you explain something to her." He said, "How does she hold them?" She said, "Like she is holding herself together while she listens." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes." He said, "I have been trying to find the right way to tell her what I think the prognosis is." She said, "She already knows what you think." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because she is holding herself together while you explain." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Come to rounds." She went to rounds. The rounds were the rounds of a teaching hospital, which meant they were both clinical and educational simultaneously, the education being not separate from the clinical work but embedded in it, the teaching happening in the doing rather than in a classroom, the doing being what produced the understanding that the classroom could only approximate. He taught the way he moved through the corridor, with the specific quality of a person who was more interested in the question than in the answer, which was the quality of a teacher who understood that the question was where the thinking happened, and the answer was only the conclusion of the conclusion being useful, but the thinking being what produced the doctor. He asked questions that opened rather than closed. He asked about what the patient in 312 was afraid of, not what the patient in 312 presented with, which was the clinical language for the same question from a different angle, the angle that most rounds took, because the clinical angle was the angle that the education was organized around. The residents answered from the clinical angle because the clinical angle was what they had been trained to speak. And he listened to the clinical answers and then asked the question again from the other angle, the angle of what the patient was afraid of, and waited for the answer that the other angle required. Catherine answered from the other angle on the second question. She had been thinking about it since the nursing station at 6 in the morning, and had the answer available the way you have things available when you have been thinking about them, without knowing you were thinking about them. He looked at her when she answered and said, "Yes." He said it the way he had said yes about Margaret Chen's hands, with the specific quality of a person who has been looking for a confirmation and has found it in a place they did not expect to find it. After rounds, he said, "Do you have a few minutes?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to talk about Chen." They went to the small office at the end of the corridor that the attending physicians used when they needed to talk about something that the corridor did not permit. He sat at the desk. She stood. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He said, "I want to tell her today." She said, "What specifically?" He said, "That the improvement in the numbers is real, and that the prognosis at 6 months is still uncertain, and that what we do in the next 4 weeks will determine a great deal." She said, "That is 3 separate things." He said, "Yes," she said. "She needs to hear them in the right order." He said, "What is the right order?" She said, "The improvement first, because it is true, and because she needs to know you see it. Then the uncertainty, because she already knows it, and hearing you say it will be a form of respect rather than a threat. Then the 4 weeks, because that is the thing she can do something about." He looked at her. He said, "You have thought about this." She said, "I sat with her at 2 a.m. for 20 minutes. He said, "Yes." He said, "Will you come with me?" They told Margaret Chen together at 4 p.m, which was the hour of the afternoon, that the light through the window of 307 was the light of a room that was still part of the day rather than preparing for the evening. The light being important in the way that the quality of the light was important when you were telling someone something they needed to hear in the fullest presence of the day, rather than in the diminishment of the approaching night. Catherine sat in the chair by the bed, and David stood at the foot of the bed, and they told her in the order Catherine had described, the improvement first, and then the uncertainty, and then the 4 weeks. And Margaret Chen held her hands, the way she held her hands when she was holding herself together. And then, at the 4 weeks, she loosened them. The loosening being the specific physical response of a person who has been given something to do with their fear, rather than only a name for it. After they left 307, David said, "Thank you." She said, "For what?" He said, "For the order." She said, "You would have found it." He said, "Not today." He said it with the honesty of a person who was accurate about what they knew and what they did not know. The accuracy being not self-deprecation, but the same quality that produced the questions that opened rather than closed, the quality of a person who was more interested in the right answer than in being the person who had the right answer. October brought the first cold of the Boston autumn, the cold arriving in the specific way of Boston cold, which was not the gradual cooling of a place that negotiated with winter, but the direct arrival of a place that understood winter as a fact rather than a possibility, and adjusted to it accordingly. The hospital in October was the hospital it was at all times, and also the hospital with the particular addition of the autumn respiratory cases that October in Boston produced. The cases filling the ward with the specific character of October illness, which had its own quality distinct from the summer illness and the winter illness, the quality being the quality of systems that had been adequate through the summer and were not adequate for the first cold, and that arrived at the hospital in the gap between the two. Catherine and David worked through October in the specific proximity of a ward that is full and a staff that is working at the capacity that a full ward requires. The proximity being the proximity of people who are doing the same work in the same space, and who develop through the doing of it. The specific knowledge of each other that shared work produces. which is a different knowledge from the knowledge that conversation produces, and that is in some ways more complete. The work knowledge being knowledge of how a person thinks and decides and responds when the thinking and deciding and responding matter, when the stakes of the thinking are not theoretical but present in the specific form of a person in a bed in room 307 or 312 or 318, whose condition is what it is and whose condition requires what it requires. She knew how he thought from watching him think. He was methodical in the way of a person who had decided that method was the form that rigor took in clinical medicine, the method being not a substitute for judgment, but the structure within which judgment was most reliable, the structure preventing the errors that the absence of structure produced, while leaving room for the judgment that structure alone could not provide. He knew the literature and used it with the specific quality of a person who had read it carefully and remembered what it said, and could therefore disagree with it when disagreement was warranted, the disagreement being not contrarianism, but the product of the same rigor that produced the method, the rigor being applied to the literature the way it was applied to the patient, with the full attention that the thing deserved. He knew how she thought from watching her think. She was attentive in the way of a person who had decided that attention was the form that care took in clinical medicine, the attention being not a substitute for knowledge, but the means by which knowledge was applied to the specific person, rather than to the category the person belonged to, the specific person being always different from the category in ways that the category could not predict, and that only attention could find. She read the patient the way he read the literature, with the full attention that the thing deserved, and what she found in the reading was what the literature could not contain. The specific human texture of the person in the bed, the fear in the hands, and the hope in the eyes, and the specific quality of the way a person breathed when they were in pain and trying not to show it. He said, on a Thursday afternoon in late October at the nursing station, while they were both writing notes, "You are a good doctor." She said, "I am becoming one." He said, "Those are not the same thing." She said, "I know." He said, "I mean the first one." She looked at him. He said, "Most residents become good doctors by accumulating knowledge until the knowledge is sufficient." She said, "And?" He said, "You started with what the knowledge is for." He said it in the same way he had said the things about Margaret Chen's hands, and the order for telling her things, with the specific quality of a man who said what he observed without inflating it or deflating it, the observation being the thing and the saying being the accurate transmission of the thing. She wrote the observation in the margin of the notes she was writing. Not his words, but what his words had made available to her thinking, the way his questions in rounds made available to the residents, thinking the things the thinking contained but had not yet produced. The margin being where she put the things that were not notes but were the thinking underneath the notes, the thinking that the notes were built on. November arrived, and with it the first real cold, the cold that Boston made when it had finished negotiating with autumn and had become what it was going to be until April. The cold settling into the city with the specific permanence of a Boston winter, visible in the way the people on the streets moved with their coats and their hats, and the specific quality of movement of people who have accommodated themselves to a fact rather than resisting it. The hospital in November was fuller than the hospital in October had been, and the ward was the ward of a hospital in November in Boston, which was the ward at the specific level of fullness that the level of fullness required from the people working in it. Catherine and David had dinner in November for the first time. Not a planned dinner, but the dinner that happened when two people who have been working the same long day in the same place are at the end of the day. And neither of them has eaten since morning. And there is a diner 2 blocks from the hospital on Cambridge Street that is open at 9 in the evening, and that serves the specific kind of food that a diner on Cambridge Street in 1952 served, which was adequate food in the adequate quantities that a person who has not eaten since morning requires. They sat across from each other in a booth by the window and ate and talked about the ward in the way of two people who have been in the same place all day and are still in it, even when they have left it. The ward being what they were both thinking about, and therefore what they talked about. The talking being both about the ward and about the thinking being the thing they were both interested in, and that the ward was the occasion for. She told him about her father, the general practitioner in Providence, and about what she had learned from watching him practice medicine for 20 years, before she had the language for what she was watching, the watching being the education that preceded the formal education, and that the formal education had either built on or had not, the building depending on whether the formal education understood what the watching had produced. He said, "What did the watching produce?" She said, "The understanding that the patient was a person rather than a condition." He said, "That sounds simple." She said, "It is not simple." He said, "No." He said, "It is the hardest thing in medicine." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the condition is what the training addresses, and the person is what the training cannot address, and the gap between the two is where most of the important work happens." She said, "Yes." She said, "That is what I have been trying to say for 11 months. He said, "You said it at 6 in the morning the first time I met you." She said, "I said it about her hands." He said, "Yes." He said, "That was the thing." They had dinner on Cambridge Street again the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, the dinners becoming the structure of the Thursday evenings. The way the sessions had become the structure of the evenings in the Harbor Light story, which was a different form of the same thing, the thing being two people who are doing the same work and who find in the doing of it that the doing is better when they are doing it together, and that the together extends beyond the work into the evenings on Cambridge Street. She knew this was happening the way she knew things about patients, through the accumulation of small observations, rather than through a single decisive moment, the accumulation being more reliable than the moment because it was harder to misread. He said nothing about it until December, which was the December of Boston in 1952, the December of a city fully in its winter, and a hospital fully in its winter capacity, and two people who had been working the same ward for 4 months and having dinner on Cambridge Street for 6 weeks. He said it on a Thursday evening at the diner, after a day that had been the kind of day that the ward occasionally produced, the kind that required everything and left a specific quality of tiredness that was not the ordinary tiredness of a long day, but the tiredness of a day that had asked for the full attention and received it. He said, "Catherine." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to say something that is not about the ward." She looked at him. He said, "I have been thinking about it since October." She said, "Since the nursing station." He said, "Since the nursing station." She said, "Say it." He said, "I think you know what it is." She said, "I want to hear you say it." He said, "I am in love with you." He said it with the directness he brought to everything that was true and that mattered, the directness being not boldness, but accuracy, the accuracy being what the thing required. She said, "I know." he said. And, she said, and I have known since the nursing station also. He said, then. She said, then yes. She said it in the way of a person who has been thinking about the right answer for a long time and has found it, and is stating it rather than performing it. He said yes. She said, yes. The winter was the winter it was, the winter of the ward and the Cambridge Street diner, and the Thursday evenings that were now the Thursday evenings of two people who had named the thing and were in it, which gave the Thursday evenings a different quality from the Thursday evenings before the naming having changed the context without changing the contents the way namings do, the contents being what they had always been, and the context being what the naming made it. They worked the same ward and had the same rounds, and sat with the same patients at 2 a.m, and wrote the same notes at the nursing station, and the work was the same work, and was also different, the difference being not in the work, but in the quality of doing it alongside the person who understood what it was for. January brought the case that January brought, the case being the case of a man named Robert Ferris, who was 54 years old, and who arrived on the 3rd of January with the presentation that he arrived with, which was the presentation of a man whose heart was doing something that hearts do when they have been doing it for a long time and have reached the point where the doing of it is no longer sustainable, the point being where it was, and the medicine being what the medicine was in 1952, which was not what it would be in 1962 or 1972, but what it was in 1952, the medicine of a decade that had learned a great deal and had not yet learned what the next decade would learn, the gap between what was known and what was needed being present in the specific way that gaps are present in medicine, as the space where the work happens, and also as the space where the work cannot reach. David worked the Ferris case with the method he brought to everything, and the full attention that the case required, and the specific quality of a doctor who understood both what the condition required and who the person in the bed was, the person being a man from Dorchester who had worked at the shipyard for 22 years, and who had a wife named Helen and 3 children, and who held his hands the way Margaret Chen had held her hands in October, in the way of a person holding themselves together while they listened. Catherine sat with him at 2 a.m. on the 4th of January, when the night was the kind of night that the ward produced, when the night was serious, and she sat with him the way she sat with patients, with the full presence of a person who understood that presence was itself a form of care, and not merely an accompaniment to it. She told David in the morning what Ferris had said at 2, not the clinical information, which was in the notes, but the other information, the information that the notes could not contain, which was that he was afraid not of dying, but of leaving Helen without having said what he needed to say to her. The fear being the fear of a man who understood his situation and whose situation was producing the specific clarity that certain situations produce, the clarity of knowing what matters because the things that do not matter have been removed by the situation. David listened with the full attention and then said, "I will call Helen this morning." She said, "He needs to call her himself." David said, "He does not know that he can." She said, "Tell him that he can." He said, "How?" She said, "Tell him what the night produced." He said, "What did the night produce?" She said, "The clarity." He said, "And the clarity is permission." She said, "Yes." He said, "You understand things about this that I do not." He said it without deflation or inflation, with the accuracy that he brought to everything he observed. She said, You understand things about this that I do not. He said, yes. He said, that is why we work together. She said, yes. Robert Ferris called Helen on the morning of January 5th. David arranged the call with the specific method he brought to arrangements, efficiently and without ceremony. The efficiency being a form of respect rather than indifference. The respect being for the thing the call was and the time it required. Catherine sat outside the room while the call happened, not listening, but present in the corridor the way she was present with patients, available without intruding. After 30 minutes, Ferris opened the door of his room and looked at her in the corridor and said, "Thank you." She said, "Dr. Pearce arranged the call." He said, "I know." He said, "I mean for last night." She said, "Of course." He went back inside, and she sat in the corridor for a moment and thought about what last night had been and what this morning was, and about the specific quality of the work when the work was what it was supposed to be, which was not always and which was this morning. Ferris died on January 19th. It was not unexpected, and it was not sudden. And it was the death that the situation had been pointing toward since the 3rd of January. The pointing being what the medicine had been managing since his arrival, and that the managing had not been able to redirect, the medicine being what it was in 1952. David told Helen, with the specific directness and care that he brought to the things that required both, and Helen received the information with the specific quality of a woman who had been expecting it, and who had said what she needed to say, because of the call on the 5th, and for whom the expected information was therefore what it was, rather than also the weight of the unsaid. Catherine wrote the notes and thought about what the notes were and what they could not contain, and about the 30 minutes on the morning of January 5th, and about what those 30 minutes had been and what they had made possible. February was February in Boston, which was the month that Boston winter produced, when it had been winter, long enough that the winter had become the only thing that the weather had ever been. The month of a city that would not see spring for 2 more months, and that had accommodated this fact with the specific pragmatism of a city that did not have the option of not accommodating it. Catherine and David worked through February and had dinner on Cambridge Street and talked about the ward and about the patients and about the medicine and about the things underneath the medicine, the things that the medicine was for, the conversation being the conversation of 2 people who were thinking about the same things from different angles, and who found in the conversation that the angles were complementary, in the way that complementary things are complementary, producing together what neither produced separately. She told him about Providence in February, about her father's practice, and the specific patients she had watched her father treat, when she was old enough to understand what she was watching, the patients being people from the neighborhood who had come to her father for 20 years, and who her father knew in the specific way of a doctor who has treated a person through the ordinary illnesses and the serious ones and the spaces between them, who knows the whole person rather than the presenting condition. He said, "That is what you are building here." She said, "I am 11 months into a residency." He said, "Yes." He said, "And you are building it the way your father built it, which is by knowing who the people are." She said, "You do the same thing." He said, "I do it differently." She said, "Yes." He said, "I do it through the method." She said, "And I do it through the attention." He said, "And between the method and the attention," she said, "Yes." He said, "That is the practice." She said, "Yes." He looked at her across the diner table in February, in the booth by the window with the Boston winter visible outside, and said, "I want to do this with you for a long time." She said, "The practice." He said, "The practice and everything else." She said, "Yes." She said it the way she had said it in December, with the quality of a statement rather than a performance, the statement being accurate, and the accuracy being what it was. March arrived with the first suggestion of the spring that March in Boston suggested without delivering, the suggestion being visible in the quality of the light rather than in the temperature, the light beginning to have the quality of the longer days that March was pointing toward without yet being the longer days. Catherine had 4 months left in her residency at the end of March, which was a fact she had been aware of since the beginning of the year, and that had been present in the background of the February dinners and the ward work and the Thursday evenings as the thing that was coming, and that both of them had been thinking about, without discussing, the not discussing being the form that certain things take when the discussing requires a readiness that the moment has not yet produced. She was accepted to a fellowship at Johns Hopkins in the first week of March. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and she read it at the nursing station between rounds and sat with it for a moment before she went back to the work that the morning required. The fellowship was in the area that her work at MGH had been pointing toward, the area being the intersection of internal medicine and the specific question she had been thinking about since her father's practice in Providence, the question of how the medicine addressed the person rather than only the condition, the fellowship being the place where the question could be worked on, in the specific way that academic medicine worked on questions, which was through the research and the writing and the formal investigation of the thing that the practice had been investigating informally, through the daily work of the ward. She told David on Thursday. She told him at the nursing station in the morning before rounds, because the morning before rounds was when they talked about the things that the day required knowing. And this was a thing that the day required knowing, which was the clinical way of thinking about it, and also the right way to think about it because the directness was what the thing required. He read the letter that she handed him, and read it the way he read things, completely and with full attention. He finished and looked at her and said, "Johns Hopkins." She said, "Yes." He said, "The fellowship is what you have been working toward." She said, "Yes." He said, "It begins in July." She said, "Yes." He said, "That is 4 months." She said, "Yes." He said, "Catherine?" She said, "I know." He said, "What do you know?" She said, "I know that 4 months is 4 months and that July is July and that the fellowship is what I need to do." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know that too." He said, "I am not asking you not to go." She said, "I know you are not." He said, "I'm asking what July means." She said, "July means the fellowship." He said, "And us." She said, "I do not know what July means for us." She said it with the accuracy she brought to things she did not know, the not knowing being what it was, which was not the absence of caring, but the presence of a situation that was larger than either of them, and whose resolution was not available from where they were standing in March. He said, "Is there a version where it means us continuing?" She said, "I think there is a version." He said, "What does the version require?" She said, "I do not know yet." He said, "I want to find the version." She said, "So do I." He said, "Then we have 4 months to find it." She said, "Yes." He said, "And if we find it?" She said, "Then we follow it." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." April was the month that April in Boston was, the month of the spring, finally arriving in the form that March had suggested, the arrival being the arrival of a city returning to itself after the winter, the return being not dramatic, but incremental, visible in the specific ways that spring was visible in Boston, in the light and the people on the streets, and the specific quality of the mornings before the hospital, that the mornings before the hospital had in April, that they did not have in February. They worked the ward in April with the knowledge of July in the background, the way knowledge of important things lives in the background, present, without being the foreground, but informing the foreground in the ways that background knowledge informs the foreground, the informing being visible in the specific quality of the attention they brought to the work, which was the attention of people who understood that the work they were doing together had a quantity attached to it, the quantity being 4 months and then 3 months and then 2. She found a version in April. She found it in the specific way that things are found when you have been thinking about them, without knowing you were thinking about them, through the accumulation of the thinking, rather than through a single moment of clarity. The version was the version of a fellowship at Johns Hopkins, and the continued correspondence, and the Thursday evenings that would become the visits that two people make when they are in different cities, and have decided that the different cities are what the work requires, and that the work is worth what it requires. She told him the version on a Thursday evening in April at the diner on Cambridge Street. He listened the way he listened to everything and then said, "I have been thinking about the same version." She said, "And?" He said, "And I think it is a real version." She said, "It requires things." He said, "I know what it requires." She said, "It requires the belief that the work is worth what it costs." He said, "I believe that." She said, "I know you do." He said, "Do you believe it?" She said, "I believe it for myself. I believe it for you. I am asking whether you believe it for us." He was quiet for a moment, the quiet being the quiet of a man who was being precise about something that required precision. He said, "I believe it for us." He said, "I believe it because the U.S. is what the version is for." She looked at him across the diner table in April in Boston, with the spring outside the window, and said, "Then we follow it." May was the last full month, and June was the month of the ending, and the beginning simultaneously. The ending being the residency, and the beginning being what came after the residency, the two things occupying the same month, in the way that endings and beginnings occupy the same moment, when the moment is a threshold rather than a conclusion. She finished her residency on June 30th. David was at the nursing station when she came out of the last rounds of the last day, and he said, "How was the last day?" She said, "The same as the other days." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is the right answer." She said, "I know." He said, "Catherine." She said, "Yes." He said, "The version is real." She said, "I know it is real." He said, "I want you to know that I know it too." She said, "I know that you know." He said, "I am saying it because it needs to be said." She said, "Yes." She left for Baltimore on July 5th, 1953. He drove her to South Station. They stood on the platform in the July morning that Boston made, the morning warm and the platform busy with the specific business of a summer morning departure. The other travelers being what the other travelers were, and the two of them being what they were, which was two people at the end of something that was also the beginning of something, and who were both present in the both of it, the ending and the beginning occupying the same platform the way they had occupied the same June. She got on the train with her luggage and her coat and the notebook she had been writing in since the first week of her residency, the notebook being the record of the thinking underneath the notes, the thinking that the formal notes could not contain. He stood on the platform, and she stood in the door of the train, and they looked at each other in the way of two people who have said what needs to be said, and are now in the moment before the train moves, the moment being what it was, which was both small and not small simultaneously. Small in the way of a moment at a train station in July, and not small in the way of a moment that contains everything that the previous 11 months had produced. She said, "The version is real." He said, "Yes." She said, "We follow it." He said, "Yes." She said, "David." He said, "Yes." She said, "The method and the attention." He understood what she meant. He said, "Yes." The train moved at 9:22. He stood on the platform until it was out of sight, and then stood for a moment longer, and then walked back through South Station, and drove back through Boston to the hospital, and went up to the 3rd floor and stood at the nursing station and looked at the corridor and the doors of the rooms and the specific quality of the morning light on the floor, and thought about what the morning was and what it was the morning of. And then he picked up the charts for morning rounds and began. She arrived in Baltimore at 12:40. She took a taxi from the station to the apartment she had arranged in March, a 2nd-floor apartment on a quiet street 3 blocks from the Hopkins campus, and unpacked her things in the specific order that she had always unpacked things: the clothes, and then the books, and then the notebook on the desk by the window, the notebook being the first thing on the desk because the desk was where the thinking happened, and the notebook was the form the thinking took, and the thinking was what the fellowship was for. She wrote a letter that afternoon. She wrote about the train and about Baltimore, and about the apartment, and about the desk by the window, and about the quality of the afternoon light in Baltimore in July, which was different from the afternoon light in Boston in July in ways she was still finding the language for. She wrote about the Hopkins Fellowship and about what she intended to do with it, and about the question she had been thinking about since her father's practice in Providence, and that the ward at MGH had been the 11 months of working on the question informally, and that the fellowship was the formal investigation of what the informal work had found. She wrote about the platform at South Station, and about the method and the attention, and about the version. She wrote, "I think the version is the right version. I think we found it the way you find the right clinical answer, by eliminating the answers that were almost right until what remained was what was accurate." She wrote, "The accurate answer is this." She wrote, "I will be here in the evenings. Write when you can. I will write back." She signed it and addressed it to Massachusetts General Hospital, 3rd floor, and put it in the outgoing mail and turned back to the desk by the window and opened the notebook and began. He received the letter on July 9th. He read it at the nursing station in the morning between rounds the way she had read things at the nursing station, completely and with full attention. He read it twice. Then he sat with it for a moment, in the specific way he sat with things that had more than one layer, the layers being not complicated but numerous, each one requiring a moment before the next. Then he turned to the chart he had been reviewing before the letter arrived and finished reviewing it, and went to morning rounds and taught the residents about the gap between the condition and the person, and asked the questions that opened rather than closed, and stood in the afternoon at the window of his office and looked at Boston in July, and thought about Baltimore, and about the version, and about the method and the attention, and about what the accurate answer was, and about the letter he would write that evening, which was the letter that the accurate answer required. He wrote it that evening at his desk. He wrote about the ward, and about the rounds, and about a new resident who had arrived in July, and who reminded him of no one, and who would need to learn what the ward could teach and what it could not. He wrote about Margaret Chen, who had been discharged in March and who had sent a note in April that said she was well and that the 4 weeks had been what they needed to be. He wrote about South Station and about the platform and about the 922 and about standing in the corridor at the nursing station after and what the standing had been. He wrote, "The version is the right version." He wrote, "I know this the way I know the right clinical answer, not because it is comfortable, but because it is what remains when the other answers have been eliminated." He wrote, "The accurate answer requires the work and the distance and the Thursday evenings that will be the visits and the letters until the visits." He wrote, "I understand what it requires." He wrote, "I am writing this at my desk in the evening in July, and you are at your desk in Baltimore, and between the two desks is the distance and the version, and the question you have been working on since Providence, and the question I have been working on since the first rounds I ever led, and the combination of the two questions, which is what the work is for." He wrote, "The method and the attention." He wrote, "The version is real." He signed it and addressed it to Baltimore and put it in the outgoing mail and turned back to the notes he had been writing before he began the letter and finished them and then turned off the desk lamp and sat for a moment in the dark office in July in Boston and thought about what the dark was and what it contained, which was the ward on the other side of the door and the city outside the window and Baltimore 300 miles south, and the version that was real, and the question that both of them were working on from different desks in different cities, the question being the question that the work had always been about, and that the 11 months, and the Cambridge Street diner, and the platform at South Station, and the letter in Baltimore and the letter in Boston had been the particular form the working had taken, the form being what it was, and the question being what it had always been, which was the question of what the medicine was for and who the person in the bed was, and what the gap between the condition and the person contained, and how to be present in the gap in a way that the gap required, which was the question that neither of them would stop working on, and that neither of them would finish, because the finishing was not the point, and they both knew it, and the knowing was what the version was built on, the version being real and being what it was, which was enough.